Okay.
Do I have to hit got it? I have to hit got it. Okay.
Yeah. So our presenter today is Lisa Franco, and she has been telling stories for more than 4 decades. So we're really excited for today's program, My Dearest Darling, Letters of Love in Wartime. As a writer and producer for the ABC television affiliate WTNH, right here in New Haven, Connecticut, she earned multiple Emmy nominations and journalism awards for her documentaries. She also served as public affairs director for the station before she became the state communities director for one of the largest nonprofit organizations in the country. While Lisa's background includes marketing, media relations, and public relations, these days she is a freelance writer and owner of Over the Moon Vintage, an online collectibles shop. Lisa's parents were members of the Greatest Generation, and her father, Nino Morizi, was a World War II Army Air Corps veteran. And she attributes this to her interest in the war and the loving relationships that developed during that period in our history. Today, Lisa and her husband, Joe, live in Connecticut and in Cape Cod, and they are proud parents of their 6th rescue dog, Maggie. So welcome, Lisa. We're really glad you're here, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Jen. You may actually hear Maggie at some point if the mailman comes to the door. We don't know, but thank you again for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this today. And also thank you to Rick Tuckman, who I used to work with at the University of New Haven before he went to the Historical Society, and for hooking me up with you. And I appreciate you having me. This story starts about 12 years ago, when I was in an antique store on Cape Cod. And as you mentioned, Jen, I am a vintage dealer, so to speak. So I'm always ducking in and out of vintage stores and antique stores and thrift shops to look for things to sell. So one day I was in Dennisport, Cape Cod. We have a condo up there that we stay in occasionally. And I was looking for some things, and I went down. It was in an old house, and I went down into the basement, and I was rooting around on one side, and I turned around, and on the other side of the basement, there was a plastic laundry basket. And I walked over, there was a sign on it that said World War II ephemera. So I looked into the basket, and inside there were piles of airmail envelopes, as well as photos and papers and all kinds of other things. Turned out there were 150 airmail envelopes in this basket. So I reached in, I pulled one letter out, and it was from a young naval officer to his sweetheart. His name was Donald Storey, and her name was Margery Stickles at the time. And he was attending the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. And he was writing to her this amazing, beautiful love letter, how much he missed her, how much sacrifice, he was serving his country, how much sacrifice he was going to be undergoing, how much he wanted to get back to her, but he couldn't. They were actually separated for over 6 years. And this was the only way they could communicate, was through these letters. He started most of the letters with "My Dearest Darling," hence the name of the book. And they were so beautiful. I literally just started to weep and cry. Amazingly enough, I didn't buy the letters on the spot. I went back home, and I could not stop thinking about them all night, and went back the next day, and I purchased the letters. My journalism career kind of, I think, led me to this. I think it was kind of in the stars, so to speak, that I found these letters. I'll talk about that a little bit later, because they literally were lost in this antique store, and I believe that I really rescued them. I started reading through these letters, and the more and more I read, the more I wanted to know the story of how these letters got into this antique store, and why, and what was the story behind Donald and Margery. The letters ended up spanning between when he was in Annapolis to when they started their romance, to when they got engaged, to when they had their first child, to when he eventually got out of the service. So it's really their whole love story in those 6 years and how their romance blossomed. They both grew up in Mount Vernon, New York, and their parents, they knew each other, but they never dated, and their parents were friends. And he went down, as I mentioned, to Annapolis, and she went to Mary Washington College in nearby Virginia. So the story goes that one day Donald needed a date for a dance, and he remembered that Margery was going to school nearby. So he called her up and he asked her for a date. And I believe this is either the first photo, this photo the family supplied me, their first photo of their first dance together when their romance just started to bloom, when they started to fall in love. So this was down in Annapolis at one of her dances that she went to. So, you know, I realized that I had to do something with these letters because of my journalism background. I had written a lot before. I'd written documentaries, as you mentioned, and articles and all kinds of other things. I also realized that I've been telling people stories, and I'm aging myself, but I've been telling people stories for over 40 years. And this was the ultimate story. I knew I had to tell Donald and Margery's story and get it out to the world. Because it was so special, and there's not a lot of folks from this generation left. There's only about 80,000 left now who served in the war. And so I knew I had the letters, I owned the letters, but I needed to find the family to get their permission still. I went through a lot of copyright, looking into copyright information, and I could not legally put a book together unless I got the family's permission. So I set out to find the family, and it took me 3 years to find them. And I couldn't find them myself. I tried on Facebook and everything. They weren't on Facebook. And eventually I mentioned it to someone I was working with, and she said, well, I know an amateur genealogist who maybe can help you. Why don't you get in touch with him? And I did, and I gave him the little information I had, and I figured it would take about 3 months or something, you know, to hear back from him. And it turned out that he called me within 24 hours, and he told me he found the family. And they were living in upstate New York at the time. Margery, who's on your screen, was still alive at the time. She was 93 years old, and she was living with her son and her daughter-in-law in upstate New York. Turns out I have an aunt who lives in upstate New York. All of these things kind of fell into place. So she lives in upstate New York. I went up to visit her. I called them. I said, I have these letters from your, you know, that I found from your parents. Can I meet you? They invited me to their house. I met Margery. Unfortunately, Margery was starting with dementia at the time, so they didn't want to let her know, you know, that I had the letters. They didn't want to upset her. But I asked them, could I have your permission to put this into a book? I told them about my background. They trusted me implicitly, and they said, yes, you have our permission. And that began my 11-year journey to put this book together, ending up self-publishing it, put the book together, chronicling their whole life, their whole story, you know, within these 6 years. Among the things that I found in the laundry basket was Margery's dance card from one of the dances that she went to with Donald. This was probably another dance, maybe not the first dance, but Mary Washington College. You can see she went with Marty with Donald. And these were some of the dances that she did, the boys that she danced with. And I love what she called, the little nicknames she called them. So Glamour Boy, Bashful, Dreamy Eyes, Refrigerator, maybe it was a football player, I don't know. And you notice that Donald's in there quite a few times, and this is only one page of her book. And she put on the bottom, I wish all my dances would be like that. And, you know, again, this was the start of everything. This is a photo of Donald when he was at Annapolis, very handsome man. And the next one, as I mentioned, this whole love affair progressed, and they eventually got married. He was able to get away for a little while to when they got married to become married back up in Mount Vernon. And this was her wedding photo. This is another photo that the family allowed me graciously to use. And this is another photo of beautiful Margery. One of the things that Donald would bug Margery about while he was in the Navy was to send him a photograph of her. And she was very happy-go-lucky, and she used to drop things. And she did not send him a photo for a while, but she did eventually send him this photo. And I didn't mention that Donald ended up serving on 3 different ships. He started out on a destroyer and then a submarine. His class was actually graduated a year early because of the war. He served on a submarine, the USS Carbonera, which you're going to see later, and it was built in Groton. So we have a big Connecticut connection here. He served on the Carbonera, but he trained on it first and was there present while it was being built, or the latter part of while it was being built. And he and Margery actually had a chance to be together for 10 months while he was training in Groton at the subbase. And at this point, Margery was pregnant. And I really think that he was able to finagle getting off the destroyer and coming to London and being able to be with her while the baby was born. This is one of the letters that part of this is in the book. This is the letter that Margery wrote to Donald to tell him she was pregnant. And you have to remember that this was their only way of communication. And he did not get this letter for a few months, so he didn't know she was pregnant. He is writing her letters all this time, having no idea that she's pregnant. And of course, he would get bundles of letters at a time because he was on these ships and he couldn't get them while he was out at sea. So he had to wait till he came into port, and then he would get these bundles of letters. So eventually he got this letter from Margery, which she wrote on January 15th, 1944. And my dearest darling, I guess the best way to start this letter is to tell the news. I went to Dr. Bell this morning, and come the end of August or the beginning of September, you're going to be a father and I'm going to be a mother. I can't help being excited and just thrilled to death, and I hope you won't be too disappointed. I'm an awfully healthy person and can work until May or the beginning of June. So she was a little ahead of her time. She still wanted to work, and there's more to the letter, but this was her. If you remember this letter, because I'm going to come back at the end and tell you an amazing story about this letter. And this is Margery working. One of the other things I found in the pile was old Texaco magazine, and she ended up getting a job as a stenographer at Texaco. So she worked all during the war until she had a baby, and I believe she was pregnant during this time. And this is the little baby that she was pregnant with. And one of the things I had to do was do a lot of deciphering of his penmanship, although it was very, very good. But some things I had to decipher. And he would call this little girl, he would call her T Nook, T apostrophe Nook. That was his little name, special name for her. Nobody knows why, but that's what he calls her throughout the book. She was actually named after her mother, but today they call her Mercy. So this is her. And once in a while, Donald was able to come home. So this is at one point where he was able to visit the baby. One of the things that I had to do as far as putting the book together, once I got the permission to do it, as far as scanning, transcribing, doing all of that was a lot of work, doing some editing to edit some things out of the letters. But what I kept in was kind of the rawness of it. And I kept in a lot of the things that he was able to tell her about, very historical events that happened during the war. He talks about Hitler, talks about Mussolini, he talks about the atomic bomb, all of these other things that he was able to tell her. But what he could not tell her was where he was war-wise or what he was doing. So there was a lot of research involved for me to annotate the letters and put introductions into them that explain what he was doing during the time that he was writing the letters. Hi, Diane. It's my friend Diane, just tuned in. So I put all of this together, and I was able to, fortunately for Google and other things, but I was able to get all of this information by going online and finding ship's logs and putting in, here's what was happening while he was writing this letter. He would go through all of this death and destruction, during the day. And then he would go up to his bunk after standing watch all night and write her these amazing, beautiful letters. But of course, he couldn't tell her that a Japanese plane crashed on their ship. He couldn't tell her that they were rescuing downed airmen. He couldn't tell her that he was about to invade the Marshall Islands. All of these things I had to look up. So that is all included in the book as well. So it really gives you kind of a well-rounded capture of that period in history. You get his firsthand descriptions, you get my annotations, you get their romance and their love together and how they sacrificed for each other. And then the other thing that you get, which is more on the fun side, is you get what movies they were listening to, movies they were watching, what songs they were listening to, Bing Crosby, books they were reading, a sock hop, a lot of those things that I ended up having also to do end notes. There's a ton of end notes in the book that explain for younger readers what all of these things are. Their song was As Time Goes By. And he refers to that a lot, when he's writing her letters. So this is the USS Carbonero that I was talking about, the ship that he was on. And I thought that this might be a good time to do a little reading of the submarine. This is from chapter 9, the submarine. According to documentation found with the letters, Donald ended his studies at submarine school in late August 1944, and in September went to work on the fitting out of a newly constructed submarine at the Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, the USS Carbonero SS-337. On March 21st, 1945, the sub departed New London with Donald aboard and served with the Fleet Sonar School at Key West, Florida until mid-April. By that time, Donald had been promoted to a lieutenant junior grade. While stationed in Key West, he and Marty spent 2 weeks together while her parents took care of the baby. All this time, Margery was living with her parents. When Donald wrote the following letter, they had just ended their visit. Parting seemed to be getting harder for the couple. And she was back in Mount Vernon, as I said, with her parents. It was written on Thursday night, April 12, 1945. My dearest darling, I still cannot realize that my whole life rode away a few hours ago. I'm sure you will be waiting for me at the next port of call. There is just no other way, not a fair one, at least. Darling, I hope the ride atop a suitcase wasn't too bad. No, it was unpleasant in more respects than one. And world, what have you done to us now? Writing to you is certainly not going to be any strain. Millions of things to ask you, tell you, and discuss with you are running through my head at this very instant. Above all, I want to tell you how very, very proud I was of the stiff upper lip you kept throughout the trial and tribulations. If you hadn't, I'm sure I would have done a little weeping myself. Darling, I love you with every corpuscle in my body. George and I stumbled slowly back after my life left, and not one word issued from the lips of either one of us. I couldn't talk, as the lungs in my throat made it feel as though it were about to give at the seams. All went as it was planned, and as it has only been a few hours since we said so long for a while, all I've done is stare into space and force a few untasty few mouthfuls down my gullet. Darling, one of the boys just stuck his head in the wardroom and said, President Roosevelt is dead. If so, it will certainly be a terrific loss to the United States and the whole world. Looks like your dad was right when he said Truman would finish out the fourth term. That is not to my liking at all. Guess it's true, as they just turned on the radio. April 12th, 1945 is a bad day all around. So you see, you're getting that firsthand history. Dearest, I'm so glad we had those 2 weeks in Key West. I thoroughly enjoyed every minute, but then I can't ever remember a minute of my life with you that I haven't enjoyed to the fullest. If two people were ever created for one another, I know well enough who they were, Margery and Donald. Wonder what you are doing right now. Wish you were running to the kitchen to try to save the burnt potatoes. Don't know why I must sit here and torture us both with memories like that. but it serves to ease the intense pain in my heart to put down on paper that which I treasure so deeply. Bet my boots Tinook would be glad to see her mommy. I sort of suspect that mommy will be glad to see her too. Give the little stinker a big old hug and a kiss for me the moment you finish reading this. Tell her to return both with plenty of gusto, just as if she were I. Love of my life, until tomorrow at this time, I'll bid you a fond adieu. I love you, dearest, above all else, and miss you terrifically already. Forever and ever yours, Donnie. This is how he wrote at 20 years old. And I mean, you can imagine today somebody writing a letter like that. Pardon. So now we're going to move on a little bit, and this is now the end of the war. And this is Donald's letter to Margery, telling her the war, you know, how excited he is that the war is over. And starts with, I love you, I love you, I love you. Isn't the news of the past 48 hours the most wonderful you have ever heard? Can't quite believe that all we have prayed for, lived for, and waited for is now almost a reality. It may be a year before our dreams come true, but it will at least be a year full of worry. It is ironic that with the war's end in but a matter of hours, I find myself as far from you as I can be and still be on the face of this earth. And you can just imagine the excitement, but then, you know, he still couldn't get back to her. And even after the war was over, he served for 2 more years. He couldn't get back to her. And his daughter was growing, and he was missing out on a lot of her developments. And he actually mentions how he's afraid she's not going to know him, you know, when he comes home. But getting back to the end of the war, he talks about the big dinner that they had. And the best part of this I love is, what I wouldn't give to be with you now. Boy, would we get stinko. So it's just, you can imagine the excitement on the Carbonero, which, by the way, I was not able to, and I still can't get a lot of information about, because submarines are very classified. They still are. So I had to use the limited information I had to say where he was. So now the war is over, and this is Donald and Margery later in life, and they ended up moving to Fairfield. He mentions that in one of his letters. Wouldn't it be great if we could get a little house in Fairfield? They lived in Fairfield for 40 years at the after the end of the war, and they raised their children. They had 3 children. And then when he retired, he went to work, and when he retired, they ended up moving to Cape Cod. And I'll spill a little spoiler, but the reason the letters wound up where they wound up is because Donald passed away, and the family held an estate sale, and they didn't realize it, but the letters accidentally got into the estate sale. And a dealer picked them up, and they wound up in that store. And I mentioned before that I really feel that if I didn't find those letters, they would have been lost forever. This book is the first time the family is reading these letters. And one of them said to me, now we're going to get the answers to the questions we wished we had asked our parents. And you can imagine me emotionally going through this project for 11 years. There were a lot of tears shed. There were a lot of times when I thought, I can just give up, you know, I can't get the copyright, I can't do this and that, but everything really fell into place. The UConn Law School was a very big help for me. They have a whole program where they were able to do all of the copyright paperwork gratis for me. And without them, I wouldn't have been able to put the book together. Are we doing okay for time, Jen? I'm not really keeping, we're good? Okay. There's one more quick letter I want to read to you before I move on. This is after the war's over, and I said that he was trying to get back to her, and he couldn't. New orders and tugging boats and everything. His 3rd ship that he was on was a landing tank ship, which was a amphibious vehicle, and he ended up being the commanding officer of that ship. So he had quite a career, but a lot of responsibility. And he had missed several Christmases, and this was written on Christmas Eve, 1946, when he, you know, was trying to get back to her and couldn't. As his feelings of isolation from his family reached new heights, Donald sat down on Christmas Eve to write this poignant letter. In an encapsulation of their journey together, he described how their awkward beginning grew into a love so strong it simply could not die. The conclusion of this letter is sheer poetry. And it was written to Margery, again, living with her parents, but they had moved from Mount Vernon and now they were living in Danbury. So another Connecticut connection. Christmas Eve, 1946. My beloved, can't help but feel a little blue today, in spite of what is called the holiday season. We have so many memories wrapped up in the last 4 Christmas days, darling. 4 years ago tonight, you took Buggy for what was to become one of the most beautiful walks in the world. I was certainly a heel that night, but though my methods were crude, the results were beautiful. Darling, I am so completely in love with you that I feel somehow that we were really made for one another. No snow here for Christmas. He was in San Francisco area. Hope you have a snowfall tonight. Hope you can remember every detail of Snooky's Christmas. I'm so anxious to hear about all her reactions. Darling, it will certainly be a very happy Christmas a year from now, our first in our own home. I know you are going to have a wonderful Christmas this year too, all of you. All Mother and Dad have talked about is spending Christmas with you and little Bit. It would be such a happy day for them. All my love, my thoughts, my dreams, and my hopes are with you tonight, dearest. Could I but hop on a star and glide to where you are, if only for a moment of beauty and love that would cause all the separating miles and hours to pale and fade away. No stars for rent, sweetheart, but I'll be around in my own special dream boat sometime between now and the dawn. A very Merry Christmas, darling, to you and our Snooky. I adore you, Donnie. He was an amazing poet, and he still wrote when he was later in life, but not love letters, wrote other things. Donald passed away from dementia, and one of their children told me that one Thanksgiving he stood up right when it was starting to get a little worse. And he stood up and he told Margery how much he loved her and how beautiful she was. So their love lasted for many, many years, and it has a happy ending, fortunately. Not fortunate for a lot of other people, who served in the war. But I wrote this letter for their family, but I also wrote it to preserve their legacy and also as a tribute to other members of this generation ones who made it back and the ones who didn't make it back. This is Margery when I visited her in upstate New York with her son. That's Don Jr. in the middle, and that's Vicky. And she was, I mentioned that she had dementia, but the Army Navy game was on TV and she was rooting for Navy. She knew to root for Navy. And these are their 3 children. That's Don again, and this is the little girl that I showed you the picture of. That's Tinook in the middle. That's Marcy, and that is Chris. Chris is the younger son, and this was taken. Margery passed away in 2017 on Christmas Day, and I was invited to her service up on Cape Cod, where they're both buried, and this was taken at their service. This is the USS Carbonero bracelet, which Donald refers to in his book, and it was one of those aha moments. And when I went to the service, Margery was wearing the bracelet. He said to Margery, "I'm sending home I guess this is what they did. I'm sending home a napkin ring from the Carbonero, and you can have it made into a bracelet." And that's what they did. That's what the wives did. And this is a very poignant photo. This was taken at Margery's service. This is her final resting place. And that's her granddaughter, great-granddaughter, I believe. I was invited to the service, and I'm going to go back to that letter that she wrote to Donald saying that she was pregnant. I was invited to the service, and I took that letter with me, and I read that at the service. And there was not a dry eye in the house. I couldn't get through it. Yeah, it was very difficult. More tears. But it was the first time that Marcy, who's now in her 70s, was hearing this letter. And she, everybody really, they appreciated it. Fortunately, the family is very happy with the book. I told them when I first sat down with them, I'm not trying to do this to be famous or make money. I'm doing it to help you and preserve their legacy. And as far as I know, there are other books out there with love letters, but they've all been written by parents of, or children of their parents. You know, these are my parents' love letters, and I put these together. As far as I know, I may be the only stranger who stumbled upon these letters and decided to do something about them and kind of keep them, you know, for posterity. So I'm going to stop the share now. Okay. Hello,
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was
You're welcome.
that was amazing.
I have a little show and tell if we have time.
Yes, absolutely.
So
Go ahead.
let me know if you can see it. This is one of the actual letters.
Yeah.
This was one from Margery to Donald. And there were only 8 letters of Donald, by the way, of Margery's that survived. I wanted to show a few things from Connecticut. This was one of the ration books when he was in New London. Everybody see that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then these are the actual ration stamps.
Yeah. For
So
coffee.
they lived on Granite Street, apartment 30 in New London. This was his submarine-based permit.
Can you hold it up just a little higher?
Higher.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's got his information on the back. So he was an officer. This is, by the way, I still have the letters, but eventually I'll be giving them back to the family. This is a Pearl Harbor matchbook.
Ah.
It's kind of cool.
Yeah.
And this is in the book. This is Japanese money that is explained in the book, but this is the Japanese issued this basically worthless money, and the soldiers and sailors would send them back and use them as souvenirs. This is a menu from Skipper's Dock in New London, Connecticut. That was in with that. And then it shows the lighthouse from New London. It's the New London Light from 1943. And then lastly, this isn't in the book, but when I was doing my research, you know, as I mentioned, I do a lot of estate sales, but I found these papers from the New Haven Register in an estate sale. This is announcing the war. It's kind of big. It was, the price of the paper was 2 cents. The New Haven Sunday Register, Sunday, December 7th, 1941.
Wow.
And it was an extra, obviously extra. And then this was also with this. This was the paper announcing that President Roosevelt had passed away.
Mm. Wow.
So it's been quite a journey for me. I learned a lot about myself within this, how tenacious I could be and keep going. But it really changed my life. It changed the course of my life, and it changed my life immensely. And I'm so happy all the people I've been able to meet through this, and things that I've been able to do like this. So thanks.
Wow, that was amazing. That one of my first questions for you was, did the family want the letters back?
Yeah, so everybody has different reactions, I guess. But they didn't ask for the letters back right away. I've been slowly giving them some things back that were in with the letters. But eventually I said, you know, I'm going to give them back to you. But if for any reason you don't want them, I'm going to try to donate them to the World War II Museum in New Orleans. They have a letters project down there. So I'm going to try to do that. But first, I'm going to try to see if they will get them back. They have a place in upstate New York. It's a compound, and they've had it for years and years and years. And Donald and Margery talk about it in the book, but in their letters in the book. And they invited us up this summer. And I don't want to put them in the mail. They're too precious. So I will bring them to them. Yeah.
Wow. So I wanted to open it up to questions to people. I did put the link to your book, My Dearest Darling, in the chat. We do have, and so if anyone has any questions, please feel free to get them in the chat. Sally had just a comment. Of course, she's saying thank you for all of your work to save this collection of letters. And Don and Margery's story. She is the beneficiary of her grandfather's letters from World War I to her grandmother in Hartford, who's also named Margery. And the letters remind her of, you know, the accounts and the words. But those letters began with "My dearest Mudge." So I love
that. That's it. I've met so many people who have their parents' letters and some who haven't read them, and they said now, thanks, Diane. They said now, you know, we're going to read them. You know,
right.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, Sally did have a question in there. What can you explain to folks what the protocol is when there's the timeline for publishing and when there's living members of the family in terms of permission?
Yeah, so what happened was, because I wasn't part of the family, so I contacted a copyright lawyer and I told him that I wanted to put these into a book. And the way he explained it to me was, you can buy a Rembrandt or a Picasso, but you can't make pictures, you can't make photocopies of it and sell them. It's still the family's property, even though I physically own the letters, but I'm going to give them back, but I physically own them. So you have to get their permission, you know, just as a legal document to put it together into a book. And that's when I ended up going to the UConn Law School. But in the copyright of the book, we had to change that. It says editorial organization copyright, which means everything that I wrote is copyrighted, but the letters still belong to the family. They have the copyright on that. So that's what you have to get legal permission. If you're a member of the family and you wanted to do something, I don't think you would have to. I would probably want to talk to a lawyer anyway, but because you're part of the family, but because I was a total stranger, right. I had to get this permission. Yeah. Unfortunately, they gave it to me.
Right. Anybody else have any questions? Certainly feel free to unmute yourself if you wanted to. While people are thinking, I wanted to ask what were some of your biggest challenges in terms of tackling this whole project from beginning to end?
There were a lot of challenges, I'm telling you. There were, one challenge was I had never written a book before and never thought I would, but I tried to go through the traditional publishing methods, you know, getting an agent and all that, which is very difficult. And I didn't want to wait too long. It already took me 11 years, so I didn't want to wait longer to get an agent and then try to get it published, because once you get an agent, you doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get it published. So I went the whole self-publishing route, and that was a big education for me, to learn how to do that, and just learn all the various facets of putting a book together and getting with the right company, you know, to help me publish it. Fortunately, my niece was an editor at the Huffington Post, so she helped me edit the book. But that whole part was a challenge. I mean, it started from the beginning, was, you know, finding the family, then finding somebody who could copyright it for me, because it would have been really expensive for me to go to an actual firm to get a copy written. And all of these different questions that I had, you know, writing the book, is this correct? Is that correct? Do I have the right information? I'm very detail oriented, so I wanted to make sure I got everything correct, for not only for the readers, but for the family. And, you know, did my research. I did my research and looking at other books, and a lot of the ones that I mentioned were written or put together by the families, and there wasn't a lot of explanation, you know, like who was who and everything. So I interviewed the family. There's an epilogue in the book that explains that. So all of these different things that, and I was working at the time too, you know, so, which is another reason why it took 11 years, but the research and putting it all together, and then just figuring out how to actually get this published now. That was a big thing for me. And so I'm, and I just feel privileged that I was able to do this, I'm for them,
Right.
it gives me warm, fuzzy feelings that, that I was able to do. And then talking to, I've talked to young people who are great. They love to see this. One young person said to me, I want this book because I want to know what true love is. And, all of they're just so caught up in everything that they're caught up in. And this was a tumultuous time. It was a lot of, uncertainty, but it was also very innocent. And all this was happening around them, but it was still an innocent time. So, and then older folks, I've met Holocaust survivors. I've met children of Holocaust survivors. I've met, people who are still World War II veterans. And then all the other veterans that came after them. I've spoken to young wives. I spoke to a young wives group at the subbase. Their husbands are now off on submarine together, and they could relate, because it's the separation still. It's still the separation and the
That
sacrifice.
might be emailed instead of letters down the line.
Right, exactly.
Sure.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sheila put in the chat, I love the preservation of story and the celebration of life, particularly with such an era with such rich history, and what a gift for the family, for sure.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And as I said, I'm so glad. That was my biggest concern was, oh no, what if they don't like it? Or if I put something in that they wouldn't want me to have put in. And I did end up editing some things out that were too personal. They feel like they're my grandparents now, my other set of grandparents. But all of those things kind of just came together, and fortunately worked out, and they're very happy about it.
Right. Well, I want to make sure, I do want to talk about, because this was such a great Connecticut story too. Yeah. I love the connections, a couple of different connections here. I do have a couple of Connecticut Historical Society collection items that I wanted to talk about, but before I do that, I wanted to see if there's any other questions, if anyone wanted to unmute themselves or add anything to the chat. I just want to give everyone a chance to do that. Elizabeth, I see
Hi,
you.
Jen.
Hi, Elizabeth. How are you?
Hi, Lisa. I'm glad to see you. I'll sort of help you, Jen, with one of the collections that's at CHS, because Lisa, I loved what you said. And I had, my father wrote to my mother just about every day for a year and a half, and I had all of his letters. And once I retired from the Connecticut Historical Society, I transcribed them, and then I donated them to CHS. And just as you were saying, as you're working on them, it becomes so emotional and you become so involved. And then sometimes I thought, oh my God, these are my father's private thoughts to my mother. And it felt a little intrusive, but at the same time, my feeling was, if I don't transcribe them and save them, who will? And I thought it was important enough. But there were a couple of things that, struck a chord with me. And that was my father served on a boat called the PGM-10. And what they would do is that they would, and in the Pacific, what they would do is they would cut the mines and let them float to the top so that the destroyers wouldn't hit them. A very dangerous job. Yeah. And he was in Okinawa during the battle, but just like you were saying, his letters home said, "Dear sweetheart, nothing much is happening. The boys are watching movies and reading books." And it only became really interesting once the letters were uncensored. And that's when the truth came out, and the letters had a very, very, very different tone. He talked about the service much more, and he talked about the Navy and the difficulty of getting off the ship once the war was over. But I think that's a great idea for you to give them to that World War II museum in New Orleans. I know where it is, and I think that's great. And I believe that a lot of World War II material was in a repository in St. Louis, and there was a fire there in the 1970s. So that's one of the reasons that I really wanted mine to get into the public records or public archives, because there's just not that many records that survive, which is so sad. But anyhow, Lisa, that's just to say, Loved hearing your program.
Thank you.
I'm going to buy that book as soon as we're moving.
Yeah, my dearestdarlingbook.com, Amazon and Barnes and Noble. You can get it on both.
Wonderful. Will do. Thank you for this. All righty.
Thank you.
Good luck with your move, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Yes, good luck with your move. Yeah, that was a concern for me, was the privacy, part of it. And but I ended up overlooking it, or trying to overlook it, because it's so historical and it needs to be shared, because this world is so much more different than it was. People need to know how people used to talk to each other, and and again, back to the sacrifices they made. There were a couple things in there I don't know if I should put that in, and the family was pretty good. The family was good with that. They understood. There was a little, I even thought, should I put this in, or should I do this or not? Maybe I should put this down. But it's such an amazing story. And, the letters that he wrote to her were all very similar to the ones that I read to you. They weren't all, oh, well, here's what we did today. We ate, and that part of that was in there too. But they were all so interesting, and so romantic and beautiful. And people, I tell a lot of people when they get the book that they need a box of tissues to read it. And people really, they feel so close to them, after reading this. And, I hope they're looking down from heaven and they're okay with it.
I'm sure they are. Well, I think it's important to include it all, but it really gives the full story of everything that was going on, and I think that's important. People can take what they want from it if they have all of it, I think, and that's important.
Yeah.
And
go ahead. I'm sorry. No, I think I actually have there were a lot more letters, obviously, that somehow were lost. They were separated for 6 years. So there weren't only 150 letters, and there's 135 letters in the book. But the way that the ones that I had were the really important ones, and, the pregnancy one and all these, the historical ones. But I think I have the last letter that one of the last letters that he wrote to her. So I was really able to end it nicely, that, the fact that he was coming home now, right. And a lot of the things that he predicted ended up coming true, like living in Fairfield and getting a job, and she would drive him to the train station and all those things. And the epilogue explains all of that.
Wow, that's great. And I love that have been able to find the family today and learn more about them. That's important.
Extremely grateful to them, extremely grateful that they allowed me to do this. They could have said no, letters back, which I would have done, but I'm so grateful that I just recognized there was something special and the story needed to be told, so.
Well, they were lucky that you found them.
Thanks. And I hope to be in touch with them for years to come.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. This is such a great presentation.
It's my pleasure.
And a happy story.
Yes, good ending. Good ending.
Yeah. We have a lot of people saying thank you in the chat.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate all of you taking time out to listen.
And I did put Lisa's book, the link to Lisa's book, in the chat. I also put, we have many letters, collections of letters in our, at the CHS from other wars and World War II. And I did put 2 in the chat as well. Of course, that's Elizabeth Abbey's father, and those letters, that collection. I put the collection title in the chat, and it also included some photos and military documents and maps in the collection. And they were from Wethersfield, so certainly a Connecticut story. And another one that I put in the chat is called the 320 Brown Street collection. And there's a lot of different things in this collection, including letters between Frank Armentano and his wife Josephine, and they wrote during World War II from 1942 up until his passing in the war. And sadly, he was killed in action in 1945. And interesting with that collection is they were discovered more recently by the current owner of 320 Brown Street. They were found, they were in a box found under the eaves. So, and I will say, I found a letter in our house that I'm new to in the ceiling tile. A letter fell out. So people hide things, and which I'm not so sure I would recommend, may or may not get found. But if you were interested in learning more about other letters, you can certainly visit the Connecticut Historical Society. We have lots in our collection. Just a little plug for us.
I'll try to find some, well, I guess there really weren't any written from New London because they were living together, but I have a few of those things, and I was going to see if the sub base wanted to have some of those permits and things too, you know, to use for there, because their museum in Groton is amazing. If no one's ever been there, it's an amazing museum.
It's definitely worthwhile. I've been there. It is wonderful. And one last plug just before we leave, we have some upcoming events I'd love to tell everyone about. On the 12th, we have a virtual program with Henry Q, who contributed to one of our current exhibitions, Journeys, Boys from the Chinese Educational Mission. Henry Q contributed his research and his translation skills for that exhibition, and he's going to talk about 3 of the students at the Chinese Educational Mission, the Shu brothers. So that will be interesting to hear a little bit more about his research. And then our other exhibit that we have going right now is the bicycle game. So we are doing a program on the 20th. It's a trivia program and lots of fun. We have some prizes as well. And the theme will be a little bit about our exhibit, but also just about games in general of all kinds. And then, of course, our next Lunch and Learn is May 2nd. That's Dr. Paulin. This talk was previously scheduled and it needed to be rescheduled, so it's happening May 2nd, and it is about the history of anti-Black racism and ableism in the U.S. that erases both the past and contemporary experiences of Black neurodivergence. So she'll talk about her archival work. Of course, for her, finding people of color in the past sometimes is more like detective work and reading between the lines. So she will talk about some of the unlikely places and unlikely collections she had to go through to find information and really fill in the historical, medical, and cultural narratives for her story. So that should be very interesting. So those are just a few things that we have coming up. Of course, you can check out chs.org for information on all our programs. And I want to say thank you again, Lisa, for such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you for having me.
Certainly send the link to the recording to everyone here today and anyone who registered. But this was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.